In the postcard's heyday, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Germany produced and sent more of these objects than any other country in the world. In 1899 alone, 88 million picture postcards were printed there, and many of these survive in private and public collections. One of the largest such collections is held by the Altonaer Museum in Hamburg, which has 1.5 million postcards, including a significant number made by artists. Among these can be found this striking and inscrutable example. The card sender was Otto Freytag, and the recipient was Willy Robert Huth, both mildly avant-garde painters who gained a degree of success in Germany in the 1920s, and both of whose careers were later derailed by the Nazis. The image in question seems to show a man with his head in the guillotine. The executioner wears historic costume, including an erect codpiece pointed suggestively at the condemned man's rear. To the left stands a priest, his hands cupped as if to receive the severed head, and above floats some kind of naked spirit. An inscription reads, Hütchen, verrecke, which can be translated as, Little Hoot, bite the dust. This seemingly identifies the condemned man with the card's recipient, making it a macabre joke on the part of Freytag, the sender, especially macabre given the moment in which it was made, 1933. But is it just me, or is the figure in the guillotine reminiscent of another and rather better known historical personage, someone whose face appears, in fact, on the other side of the card? If this really is meant to be Hitler, and the card is a lightly concealed condemnation of the Führer to death, why would anyone risk such a dangerous and futile gesture of defiance at this time? And why has the card been so roughly treated, seemingly deliberately so? Finally, are these things connected? Was the image abused because of its subversive content? I must admit now that I cannot answer any of these questions conclusively. What I will do instead is to place the card in a context that illuminates its potential status as a piece of mailed resistance, specifically the first half of the 20th century in Germany, where it seems scarcely a single prominent artist did not at some point or another send a self-designed postcard, and where the state took a very close interest in the function of its mail system. These artists and their postcards have been individually discussed in a number of essays, but no one has yet attempted the larger project of which this is a part. That is, to place the postcard in what I call the image economy that circulated early 20th century Germany. As part of this broader and more systematic investigation, I want to consider how unique or amended postcards fit into the image economy of the mail, how they negotiated its conventions, and whether they managed to subvert them. This question is important because, considered from the standpoint of one of the dominant strands of media theory today, that is, the Friedrich Kittler school that underpins the notion of media archaeology, media dictate what we do with them. This totalizing judgment has in fact been applied to the postcard by Bernhard Siegert, a prominent follower of Kittler. Siegert has argued that the postcard is a technique of standardized communication, and furthermore, that when it superseded the letter, once the means of producing the individual subjectivity was itself destroyed. It is certainly the case that the German government, whether in the imperial period, the republic, or the dictatorship, was anxious to control the medium, albeit with varying degrees of severity. Since at least 1893, for example, the Supreme Court had busied itself with the question of whether so-called art postcards, which usually meant postcards reproducing painted nudes by old masters such as Titian, were not in fact obscene images. Numerous printers and distributors of such cards were prosecuted under the Obscene Publications Act, and this continued after the war and into the later 20s. But this kind of thing is clearly not what Ziegert is alluding to when he talks about the postcard's disciplinary function. He is more concerned with the format and the way this determines the inscription. Ziegert's determinism also excludes a long history of disruptive intervention by users of the postal system. For instance, it has been argued that Dadaist photomontage originated in the postcards mailed between home and the front by artists during the First World War, among them Raoul Haussmann, George Grosz, and John Heartfield. Heartfield later claimed that in order to get critical statements past the censor, these artists turned from words to photomontage. Was the subjectivity of these card senders really wiped out by their postal activity, despite this activity being designed to evade the system that would actually have subjugated them had they been discovered? None of the wartime ancestors of Dadaist photomontage survive, but the Dadaists continued in this vein, leaving many extant examples. Among these can be counted cards based on a series published by the Berlin gallery Der Sturm, which was known for its support of expressionist artists. The cards feature portraits of artists and writers associated with the gallery, and the slightly pompous self-promotion of these is punctured by Raoul Haussmann, who sent crudely graffitied examples to several acquaintances. In any case, if we seek instigators for subversive postal strategies, we do not have to look to the classical avant-gardes, because the defacement and subversion of postcard images is an old demotic practice, as old as the postcard itself. This anonymous card, for instance, was made around 1903, and it bears an image of the Kronprinzenpalais in Berlin that has been augmented with deflating elements from other printed sources. These include a headline about a double suicide, possibly a reference to the notorious Meierling incident of 1889, in which the Kronprinz of Austria killed his lover and himself, and this is juxtaposed with an advertisement for a baldness remedy. Indeed, the very first identified postcard, which was sent in 1840 in London, bears a hand-drawn image of a group of postal workers around an ink pot. In an essay on expressionist postcards, Liliana Weisberg suggests that this card, which was addressed to, and it is presumed also sent by, the writer and practical joker Theodore Hook, was in fact meant for the audience of postal workers who would handle it, with clearly satirical intent. This raises the question: when we send messages, are they really intended for the addressee, or for the apparatus of delivery? So, fortified by the pugnacity of the Hitlerians, let us proceed with the following hypothesis. The addressee is always the postal system itself. This is one answer to the enduring question, who is the postcard's public? The idea that sending a postcard constitutes a form of making public is often repeated in the context of mail art, or the postcard more generally, but it seems to me that it could do with closer examination. To give a recent example, in her 2018 book, Picturing the Postcard, Monica Cure asserted that, because large numbers of people sent and received postcards, the medium served as a means of publication. This certainly does obtain if we consider the postcard as a mass-produced printed commodity. But there is a slippage of meaning here, because if we are concerned instead with the individually inscribed card, this is in fact a non sequitur, since each one of these many postcards was sent and received only once, and a public of one is no public at all. However, before we go any further, I must modify this restrictive view immediately, because in this period the amended postcard was certainly used as a limited means of publication, by artists taking advantage of the multiple nature of the printed object. Consider, for instance, Haussmann's defaced Der Sturm postcards, or Kurt Schwitter's promotional subversion of postcards that he had had printed of himself and his works, or Theo van Doesburg's extensive postcard activity, which included defaced reproductions of work by other artists. The most famous of these is a card showing the original Bauhaus building in Weimar, which has been amended with billboard-sized inscriptions reading Der Stil. This redecoration of the Bauhaus with the name of the movement that van Doesburg had founded is a kind of visual declaration of his ambitions. The following year he was to move nearby, with the hope of joining the Bauhaus staff, and when the school's director, Walter Gropius, rebuffed his attentions, he gave his own rival lectures for its students. Here, the amended postcard functions as a visual manifesto for a sympathetic, if solitary, audience. The Bauhaus itself was an incessant publisher of promotional cards, including the one amended by van Doesburg, and numerous later examples showing the Gropius-designed building at Dessau. This one was amended with altogether less subversive intent by a student at the school, who wrote to thank his mother for the applesauce. It seems to me that this fulfills the goal of the Bauhaus in printing these cards, not only by distributing mini Bauhauses around the country, but also by making the Bauhaus homely. But the supporters of modernism, as they fought among themselves and promoted their ideas via the postcard, were not the only force at work in the image economy of the German postal system. They also faced implacable enemies. This famous postcard was published the same year that the Bauhaus student sent his domesticating card. Here, on the contrary, modern architecture, specifically the famous and controversial settlement of modern houses built at Weissenhof in Stuttgart in 1927, is made to look like an Arab village, a racist accusation that modern architecture was not at home in Germany. Gradually, these postcard-born accusations would gain the upper hand, and the Bauhaus would be forced to close shortly after the Nazis took power. Now we return to the circumstances with which we began, in which Otto Freytag made his ambiguous and violent caricature of Willy Robert Huth. Once more, as had been the case during the preceding war, the censor seizes control of the mail network. Card senders dealt with this situation in different ways. Did Otto Freytag, for instance, intend his image to show Huth or Hitler? Others responded with clear and rather contemptible acquiescence, such as Max Pechstein, who went from avant-garde missives to this self-portrait with his son in a Hitler Youth uniform. There is also the case of the painter Willy Baumeister, whose work had been included in the Nazi exhibition of degenerate art in 1937, and who was forbidden from working by the regime. Fortunately, that same year a sympathetic paint manufacturer named Kurt Herbert set up a paint research institute in the city of Wuppertal and hired a group of artists and architects whose work had been declared degenerate by the government. They were ostensibly developing new types of lacquer for military application, especially camouflage, and they were therefore exempt from military service. Ironically, given their supposed work with camouflage, the institute itself functioned as a form of camouflage, and this subterfuge extended to the extracurricular activities of its members. Baumeister, for instance, made a series of collages subverting works of art approved by the Nazis, including several postcards showing paintings by Adolf Ziegler, the president of the Reich Chamber of Visual Arts, who had been tasked with the purification of degenerate elements such as Baumeister. Baumeister's revenge was to deface Ziegler's work and, with great chutzpah, to send some of these images through the mail, albeit in sealed envelopes. Another of Baumeister's colleagues at the Wuppertal Institute, the erstwhile Bauhaus master Oskar Schlemmer, openly mailed this abstract image made using lacquer paint developed at the Institute. Schlemmer sent this card to his friend and patron Dieter Keller, who was then in service on the Eastern Front. This image, is it research or artwork? Military-industrial service or subversion? And was it able to get past the censor precisely because it was abstract, despite abstraction being the cause of its author's ostracism? In light of my earlier hypothesis that postcards are always mailed to the postal system, not just through it, the covert but still risky mailing strategies of Baumeister and the carefully cultivated ambiguity of Schlemmer are revealed as experiments in establishing the limits of the permissible under Nazi rule, what is and isn't mailable. And we might be playing the same game today, whether we know it or not. Whenever we send an email or a text to our friends and colleagues, we are also writing to intelligence agencies who screen everything for so-called security purposes. For Baumeister and Schlemmer, testing these limits under very different circumstances to our own, this was a dangerous game of cat and mouse. But both of their experiments pale in comparison to the postcard work of quite an ordinary couple, Elise and Otto Hampel, who lived in Berlin in the 1940s. Following the death of Elise's brother at the front, the previously apolitical pair were radicalized. They turned against the regime, and over the course of 2 years, they left around 200 postcards inscribed with anti-Hitler slogans across the city. They thereby circumvented the mail system entirely, transforming the postcard, usually a relatively intimate means of communication, into a miniature billboard, easy to transport and yet visible enough to spur the authorities to a massive manhunt. On the 8th of April, 1943, the Hampels were executed at Plötzensee prison. They were killed by guillotine.